What if the economic system you were born into was never designed to help you rise, but to keep you exactly where you are? What if the struggles you face today are not accidents of history, but deliberate outcomes engineered generations ago? When you look closely at the cycles of collapsing empires, manipulated currencies, and global financial traps, a disturbing pattern emerges. Someone built an economic model that feeds on entire populations, and most people never realize they're inside it. The question is, how deep does this design go, and why does it repeat with such precision across centuries? From the fall of ancient monarchies to the implosion of modern superpowers, the same hidden architecture keeps reappearing. You see it in the rise and decay of global currencies, in the creation of debt systems that expand endlessly, and in the narratives crafted to make people believe everything is normal. But what if normal is the illusion? What if the very structure of the economy is a mechanism that transfers power upward, generation after generation, while leaving everyone else struggling to understand why life keeps getting harder despite working more than ever? There is a reason the wealth gap widens in every empire just before collapse, and a reason governments always insist that everything is under control, even when the foundation is cracking beneath them. And here's the part that should make you pause. The warnings have been here all along, hidden in the historical, patterns that repeat themselves with mathematical consistency. The overextended empires, the expansion of credit, the depreciation of money, the loss of productive capacity, the rising frustration of citizens, these aren't coincidences. They're symptoms of a system functioning exactly as engineered. The question now is not whether the pattern is real, but how far we've already gone inside it. You might discover that what feels like a personal struggle is actually part of a global framework, designed long before you were born. You may even recognize pieces of your own life woven into this structure, and that realization alone can be unsettling. Before we go deeper, I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt like the economic game was rigged long before you even had the chance to play? If this beginning resonates with you, drop a comment sharing your experience. Hit the like button to help this message reach more people, and check whether you're already subscribed so you don't miss the unfolding of this entire story. And what comes next might surprise you, and the path we're about to follow will reveal patterns most people never see. Yet they shape everything around us. The deeper you look into history, the clearer it becomes that economic control never emerged by accident. It was engineered, refined, and perfected across centuries by groups that understood one powerful truth. If you control the flow of money, you control the direction of society. Long before modern nations existed, long before global markets or digital banking, early elites recognized that wealth wasn't just a resource, it was a weapon, one that could structure entire civilizations around dependence rather than empowerment. And the earliest versions of these systems set the foundation for the traps we still live inside today. You can trace this back to ancient empires, where rulers discovered that economic pressure was more effective than military force. Armies could conquer land, but financial mechanisms could conquer minds. Slowly, the ruling classes built systems where citizens relied on them for grain, for credit, for protection, all while giving up autonomy without even realizing it. Over time, these methods evolved into more sophisticated forms of control. When monarchies needed to fund wars, they sold future wealth through bonds and taxes, locking their populations into generational obligations. When early banking families rose to power, they created models that made entire nations dependent on loans that could never truly be repaid. And every iteration carried the same pattern: centralize money, decentralize accountability, and trap the public between survival and obligation. And what's unsettling is how consistent this evolution has been. Every empire discovered that engineering economic dependence created stability for the elite and immobility for everyone else. People were told they were participating in progress, but what they were really doing was entering systems designed to extract more than they offered. And as economies expanded, so did the complexity of these mechanisms. Instead of direct taxation, indirect forms of extraction emerged: inflation, devalued currencies, mandatory credit, interest structures that quietly drained wealth from the bottom upwards. These weren't random developments. They were deliberate strategies built over generations by individuals and institutions that understood the power of shaping financial behavior. By the time modern nations emerged, the template was already set. The world no longer needed kings to maintain control. It needed financial architects who could build systems so convincing that most people would never question them. And that's the hidden origin of the economic model trapping entire generations today. A long lineage of engineered dependence disguised as opportunity, stability, and growth. As these early systems evolved, something even more calculated began to take shape: the deliberate construction of financial mechanisms designed not merely to control populations, but to bind them to economic structures they could never escape. Once rulers, merchants, and early bankers realized how powerful dependency could be, they stopped treating economic pressure as a temporary tool and started shaping it into a permanent architecture. Across continents and eras, you see the same blueprint emerging, as if each generation of elites inherited a manual for how to keep entire societies locked into cycles that benefit the few while restraining the many. These traps were subtle at first. Kingdoms discovered that if citizens owed the crown money, they were far less likely to rebel. A person in debt has no time, no leverage, and no freedom to challenge authority. Over the centuries, this evolved from simple taxation to more complex systems: credit obligations, mandatory tithes, forced labor exchanges, and financial penalties disguised as civic duty. The brilliance of these early structures was how naturally they blended into daily life. People believed these burdens were simply the cost of belonging to society, unaware that they were stepping into traps designed to limit mobility for generations. As markets expanded and trade networks connected distant regions, financial architects recognized the opportunity to scale these traps far beyond local governments. That's when debt shifted from a personal burden to a national strategy. Empires discovered that lending money to, smaller states created long-term leverage. The borrower was not just indebted financially, they became indebted politically, strategically, and culturally. The debt could be renegotiated, extended, refinanced, but never dissolved. Once a nation entered the web, escape became nearly impossible, and while these nations believed they were securing growth, they were actually giving up sovereignty piece by piece. This same logic eventually applied to ordinary people. As banking systems matured, new forms of dependence appeared. Mortgages lasting decades, credit systems with compounding interest, educational debt that followed individuals throughout adulthood. People were persuaded to see these obligations as pathways to success, yet each one tethered them more tightly to institutions that profited from long-term repayment. The quiet genius of these mechanisms was that they normalized lifelong debt as a marker of progress rather than a symptom of entrapment. And once the population internalized this belief, the system no longer needed force. It could operate through expectation, culture, and routine. By the time modern economies fully integrated these structures, the trap was invisible. People entered it voluntarily, believing they were building a future, never realizing they were stepping into a framework constructed long before they were born. And with each generation, the architecture grew stronger, more refined, more intricate, ensuring that the cycle not only continued, but expanded. As the financial traps expanded across continents, a new kind of power emerged, not through thrones, armies, or visible authority, but through individuals and institutions who understood how to shape economies from the shadows. These architects rarely appeared in history books, yet their influence reshaped nations far more than kings or generals. They were the strategists who figured out that controlling capital flows, debt issuance, and monetary supply was far more effective than ruling through force. Instead of commanding armies, they created frameworks. Instead of enforcing laws, they engineered incentives. And instead of conquering territory, they conquered dependency. Their genius was subtlety. They crafted mechanisms so embedded within society that people embraced them willingly. By influencing currency standards, they could determine which nations thrived and which collapsed. By controlling credit, they could decide who rose economically and who would remain trapped. They mastered the art of positioning themselves between governments and their citizens, becoming indispensable intermediaries who provided solutions to crises, many of which they quietly helped create. These architects understood one profound truth. If you can make a nation believe your system is essential, then your power becomes unchallengeable. Over time, they learned to manipulate cycles. Inflation, deflation, expansion, recession, each became a tool rather than an accident. If a population grew restless, a sudden wave of cheap credit could calm frustration. If governments became too independent, tightening financial conditions could bring them back in line. This wasn't chaos, it was choreography. Entire economies moved according to the rhythms set by people the public rarely knew existed. And because their influence operated behind layers of institutions, banks, treasuries, central authorities, their fingerprints never appeared on the crises that followed. But the most sophisticated form of manipulation was narrative. And these architects understood that people accept suffering more easily when they believe it is natural, unavoidable, or their own fault. So they shaped the stories that surround money, that debt is normal, that inflation is unpredictable, that financial crises simply happen. They positioned themselves as protectors during turmoil, even when the turmoil was a predictable outcome of the systems they designed. By controlling the explanations, they controlled perception. And by controlling perception, they secured compliance. What makes their influence so remarkable is that most people still imagine the economy as an organic force, not a constructed one. But the patterns are too precise to be coincidence. The timing of crises, the recurring cycles of collapse, the concentration of wealth, none of it is random. It is the result of centuries of refinement by those who learned not just how to engineer economic structures, but how to engineer belief. And once belief is shaped, the system no longer needs coercion. It sustains itself through expectation, habit, and trust in ideas planted long ago. Before we move forward, I want to hear your thoughts. Which part of this hidden architecture do you feel most influences your life today? Leave a comment sharing your perspective. Your insight adds depth to this conversation and helps uncover patterns many people never notice. As these financial mechanisms evolved, their influence began to shape not just nations, but the very nature of global power. Modern empires no longer rise and fall solely through military dominance. They rise through monetary control, and they collapse when their engineered systems can no longer sustain the illusion of stability. The patterns that once governed ancient kingdoms now operate on a global scale, hidden beneath the surface of currency markets, trade agreements, and international financial institutions. And once you see the continuity, it becomes impossible to unsee how today's world mirrors the same structures that trapped entire civilizations in the past. Modern currencies are the clearest example. Every major reserve currency in history followed a predictable trajectory: dominance, overextension, debasement, and decline. The Spanish real, the British pound, the Soviet ruble, each one gained influence through economic strength and then lost it through the same engineered pressures that reappear century after century. Today's global currencies operate under similar conditions. They are supported not by gold or tangible value, but by confidence, narratives, and systems designed to expand debt indefinitely. When confidence falters, the architecture begins to shake, revealing how fragile the entire structure truly is. These patterns don't just affect nations, they define global relationships. A country with a strong currency can impose its will indirectly, influencing trade, setting standards, and shaping economic policies in other regions. A country with a weak currency becomes dependent, often forced to accept terms that reinforce the same imbalance that created its vulnerability in the first place. This isn't accidental. It is the modern version of imperial control, achieved not through colonization, but through financial expectations, lending conditions, and currency pressures that leave weaker nations with no viable alternatives. And at the center of these dynamics lies a sophisticated interplay between governments, central banks, and private financial entities. Each claims independence, yet their actions repeatedly align in ways that reinforce the same cycle: expansion of credit, artificial stability, and eventual correction. These corrections, often called crises, are the moments when the hidden design becomes visible. They reveal how far an empire has extended itself and how dependent its population has become on the very systems that are now unraveling. The public experiences these moments as shocks, but within the architecture, they are inevitable outcomes of a structure built to expand until it breaks. What makes this even more unsettling is how deeply these patterns permeate everyday life. Currency values determine purchasing power, debt levels shape personal futures, and national deficits influence everything from wages to housing to the cost of survival. Whether people realize it or not, they are living inside a global financial cycle crafted long before their generation existed, and the forces that shape these cycles continue to operate quietly, preparing the stage for the next phase, a phase that history suggests will not be gentle. One of the most powerful tools in this entire system is the illusion of prosperity. Empires and governments learned long ago that people remain compliant not when they are genuinely thriving, but when they believe they are on the cusp of thriving. Hope becomes a currency, and it is far more effective than force. Modern economic systems perfected this concept by turning growth into spectacle, progress into narrative, and dependency into a social norm so deeply woven into everyday life that most people never question it. This illusion is built through carefully crafted signals that appear to represent progress: rising stock markets, booming real estate prices, expanding credit, and headlines celebrating economic milestones. But beneath those signals lies a different reality, one built on borrowed money, inflated valuations, and systems designed to keep people locked into perpetual repayment cycles. Prosperity becomes performative, a facade of abundance maintained by ever-increasing levels of debt. Individuals are encouraged to chase lifestyles financed not by savings or stability, but by credit lines and financial obligations that tie them to institutions for decades. And it works brilliantly because the system rewards participation. You earn points, you build credit scores, you receive pre-approved offers presented as badges of achievement. People are praised for owning homes they will spend most of their working lives paying for, celebrated for earning degrees purchased with loans that shape their financial destiny, and encouraged to consume, always consume, because consumption fuels the illusion. Every step of this process reinforces the idea that dependency is not a trap, but a marker of success. The more you owe, the more you're told you belong. Governments play a central role in maintaining this narrative. When growth slows, they stimulate. When markets tremble, they intervene. When public confidence dips, they reassure with promises of stability and recovery. But these measures rarely address the underlying design. Instead, they reinforce it, pushing societies deeper into cycles that require constant expansion just to maintain the appearance of health. Prosperity becomes less about productivity and more about perception, an elaborate balancing act where the slightest shift exposes how fragile the entire system truly is. Meanwhile, the real economy, jobs, wages, productivity, lags behind the illusion. People work harder than ever yet remain unable to bridge the gap between effort and reward. In many societies, 2 or 3 generations now live with the same unspoken truth. Despite technological advancement and record-breaking markets, economic security feels further away than ever. And that tension, the widening distance between what people are told and what they experience, is exactly what the architects of these systems rely on. As long as individuals keep believing that prosperity is just one more promotion, degree, or loan away, the cycle continues. The illusion remains intact, and the dependency deepens quietly, silently, inevitably, preparing the ground for the next stage of the pattern. As the illusion of prosperity takes hold, another layer of engineering begins to operate, a layer designed not to build the structure of economics, dependence, but to protect it. This is where narratives come into play. Empires have always understood that controlling information is just as important as controlling money, because the moment people recognize the mechanics behind their struggles, the entire system becomes vulnerable. So the architects of modern economies refined a different kind of weapon, stories that disguise collapse as natural, crisis as unpredictable, and systemic extraction as responsible governance. These narratives appear everywhere. When currencies lose value, people are told it is temporary. When debt levels skyrocket, they are assured it is manageable. When inflation eats away at savings, officials claim it is under control. Each explanation is delivered with calm certainty, crafted to soothe rather than inform. And because these reassurances come from institutions people are conditioned to trust, central banks, financial ministries, global organizations, the public rarely questions their validity. They hear confidence and mistake it for truth. But behind the curtain, the pattern is unmistakable. Every major financial collapse in history was preceded by a period of official optimism. The same phrases repeat across centuries. The fundamentals are strong. The situation is stable. This is only temporary. These reassurances are not coincidences. They are strategic tools designed to maintain order while the underlying structure continues its decline. By the time the truth becomes undeniable, it is too late. People discover they were living inside a narrative crafted to delay panic until the system had already reached critical failure. Modern society is even more vulnerable to these stories because information moves faster than ever. Narratives can be amplified instantly, repeated endlessly, and accepted globally in a matter of hours. And while this connectivity could empower people, it often does the opposite. It creates echo chambers where official explanations drown out dissent, where alternative viewpoints are dismissed as misinformation, and where the complexity of economic reality is reduced to simplified talking points that keep populations passive and compliant. These narratives also exploit psychological tendencies. People want stability. They want to believe the system works. They want to feel protected. So when officials promise recovery, when analysts project growth, when institutions warn against overreacting, the public clings to these assurances even as their lived experiences contradict them. They sense the pressure rising, higher costs, stagnant wages, growing anxiety, but the narrative tells them everything is normal, and that dissonance keeps them trapped in uncertainty, unsure whether to trust their instincts or the voices that claim to speak with authority. Yet beneath the surface, the truth remains the same. Collapse is never sudden. It is prepared, justified, softened, and explained away until it becomes unavoidable. And the stories people are told along the way are designed not to reveal the truth, but to delay its impact long enough for the system to protect itself. What seems like reassurance is often a shield, one that hides how far the pattern has already progressed and how little time remains before its consequences become impossible to disguise. Before we move forward, I want to hear from you. What narrative do you feel has been used most effectively to hide the real state of the economy? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective helps uncover what many people overlook. As these engineered cycles tighten, the consequences become most visible in the lives of those born into systems already deep into decline. Entire generations now inherit the weight of decisions made long before they existed. stepping into an economic landscape designed not to uplift them, but to ensure their dependence. The pressures they face are not isolated struggles, they are symptoms of a structure that reached its breaking. Point decades ago, leaving the youngest members of society to carry burdens they never chose and could never prepare for. You see it in the cost of basic survival. Housing prices detached from wages, making home ownership a distant dream rather than a natural milestone. Education transformed into a debt trap that promises opportunity while delivering decades of financial restraint. Healthcare, once a public good, now a source of chronic anxiety. Every essential element of adult life has been absorbed into a system that monetizes necessity and converts aspiration into long-term obligation. And as each generation tries to rise, they find themselves stepping deeper into the very traps that were engineered to hold them in place. Even the concept of stability has changed. Previous generations could build savings, own property, raise families, and retire with dignity. But today's adults navigate a reality where saving feels impossible, where jobs provide less security, and where rising costs consume every gain. They were told that hard work would guarantee a better future. Yet many discover that effort alone cannot overcome structural barriers designed to extract more than they give back. The promise of social mobility has become a slogan rather than a certainty, and the gap between expectation and experience grows wider every year. The emotional impact is just as significant as the financial one. Uncertainty becomes a constant companion, creating an undercurrent of stress that shapes decisions, relationships, and long-term plans. People postpone milestones not because they lack ambition, but because the system has reshaped the timeline of adulthood. What once seemed achievable in early life now requires decades of effort, if it can be reached at all. And in the background, the narrative insists that the struggle is personal, not systemic, that the fault lies in individual shortcomings rather than in an economic model meticulously engineered for dependency. Yet, despite these pressures, something remarkable is happening. New generations are questioning the stories that older systems relied upon for centuries. They notice the contradictions, the inequalities, the recurring cycles that no longer align with the promises they were given. They see how much of their future is determined not by their choices, but by structures built long before they were born. And this awareness marks a subtle shift in the pattern, the moment when the population begins to recognize the architecture around them, even if they don't yet know how to escape it. The farther we move into the present, the more the future begins to resemble echoes of the past. Every major economic era believes it is unique, too advanced or too sophisticated to repeat the mistakes of previous civilizations. Yet the patterns forming around us mirror the same cycles that preceded the collapse of empires throughout history. What we call progress often masks the same foundational weaknesses: rising debt, declining trust, manipulated currencies, shrinking productive capacity, and a widening gulf between those who design the system and those who must survive within it. The warnings are not new, they are simply easier to overlook in an age overwhelmed by information. Historical cycles show that decline rarely feels like decline while it's happening. It feels like volatility, uncertainty, or transition. It feels like temporary disruptions that experts insist will resolve themselves. But beneath the surface, the deeper markers of collapse are already at work. The erosion of middle-class stability, the normalization of economic stress, and the growing belief that institutions no longer serve the public. These shifts don't unfold in dramatic moments. They accumulate slowly, shaping behaviors, expectations, and attitudes until an entire society adapts to conditions that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Today's world follows that pattern with remarkable precision. Nations that once held unquestioned power now struggle under the weight of their own debt. Currencies that served as global anchors show signs of strain. Economies that once thrived on innovation now depend on speculation and artificial stimulation to maintain even the appearance of growth. And as these pressures intensify, the public becomes more aware, more anxious, sensing that something fundamental is shifting even if they can't articulate its shape. This is how the final stages of historic cycles always begin, not with catastrophe, but with a subtle recognition that the old model no longer functions as it once did. Technology accelerates the pattern rather than breaking it. Information moves faster, crises spread quicker, and the financial system has become so interconnected that a single failure can ripple across the world in hours. Globalization, once seen as a stabilizing force, now amplifies the vulnerabilities embedded in the system. A currency shock in one region can disrupt supply chains on another continent. A policy decision in one country can destabilize markets worldwide. The system functions smoothly as long as confidence remains intact, but confidence is the most fragile component of all. Once doubt spreads, the architecture that seemed unbreakable can unravel with astonishing speed. And yet, within this uncertainty lies a deeper inevitability. The next phase has already begun. The signs may be subtle, but history recognizes them well. The narratives shift, the tensions rise, the structures strain under their own weight. Whether the coming transformation is slow or sudden, gentle or severe, depends less on new ideas and more on the same forces that shaped every collapse before this one. The future is not mysterious. It is simply the continuation of a pattern humanity has seen many times, one we are only now beginning to acknowledge. As the pattern stretches forward, it becomes clear that we're not simply witnessing another economic cycle. We're living through the unfolding of a design that has been shaping societies for generations. The systems that once promised stability now reveal themselves as structures built for extraction, not empowerment. The institutions people trusted for clarity now struggle to explain realities they can no longer control. And the individuals navigating this world, ordinary people, families, workers, young adults stepping into their future, are left to make sense of a landscape that feels increasingly unfamiliar, even though its underlying mechanics have been centuries in the making. What we're experiencing is not an accident of economics, but the continuation of a blueprint refined by history and expressed through modern systems, with far more reach than their predecessors ever imagined. You can feel it in the subtle shifts that shape daily life, the rising cost of living that moves just a little faster than wages, the sense that every advancement comes with a hidden price, the growing reliance on credit to maintain a standard of living that once required far less effort. These are not isolated outcomes. They're signals of a cycle nearing a critical point. And the deeper you look, the more the similarities between past empires and our current moment become impossible to ignore. The same optimism before decline, the same narratives used to justify unsustainable decisions, the same concentration of power into the hands of those who understand the architecture better than anyone else. Each piece fits into a story that humanity has lived through many times, yet never seems fully prepared to recognize in real time. Still, understanding the pattern changes something. When people begin to see the mechanisms behind the pressure, the confusion that once felt personal becomes part of a larger map. The struggles make sense in a new way, not as individual failures, but as outcomes engineered by design. And that awareness is powerful. It creates space for reflection, for clarity, for choosing to navigate the system with open eyes instead of inherited assumptions. It doesn't solve the problem, but it shifts the perspective. It reveals that the path forward isn't about pretending the cycle isn't happening. It's about understanding where you stand within it and what comes next. And if you've stayed with this story until now, it tells me something important. You see the pattern forming too. You feel the weight of these cycles in your own life, and you understand the value of recognizing them before they reach their breaking point. So if this journey through history and hidden architecture resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel. Not out of obligation, but because the more you understand these forces, the better prepared you are for the shifts ahead. And if you made it all the way to this final moment, let me know you're here by commenting with a simple phrase, "I'm with you until the end." It's a small signal, but it shows you're part of the conversation and paying attention to what others overlook. If you feel connected to this message, a like on the video helps bring more people into this discussion. People who might be searching for the same clarity you're finding now. And when you're ready to go deeper, there's another video waiting right beside this one, a continuation of the same thread, exploring the next layer of these economic cycles. Click it and keep moving with me. The story doesn't end here. This is just where the next chapter begins.